Hey everyone, it's Retro DM Ray. I am back with you on the channel for another video. This continues my series of reading through some various articles in the Best of Dragon magazines. This is again from Best of Dragon Volume 1 and from the Strategic Review and Dragons Volumes 1 and 2. Again, if you're liking this content, please give me a thumbs up. Please give me a like, a subscribe. I noticed that a lot of people that view the videos are not actually subscribers. I'd love for you to go ahead and make the plunge and click on that subscribe button. This is always a G-rated, apolitical, a-cultural mess channel. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. We're just going to talk about some good old school gaming together, as I've said many times on the channel. And I hope you'll tune in and enjoy this kind of stuff with me. And today we are taking a look at this article in this Best of Dragon Volume 1 by Rob Kuntz. The section is titled From the Sorcerer's Scroll. And Rob's going to talk about Tolkien in Dungeons & Dragons, but he talks about something else as a wider issue in relation to this particular topic. So let's get into this article. He says, Tolkien in Dungeons & Dragons. Many people who play D&D and enjoy D&D still have their complaints to offer TSR in one form or the other. One which crops up persistently is the comparison issue between Dungeons & Dragons and that of J.R.R. Tolkien's works. Some people get to the crux of the matter by stating the obvious disagreements between Tolkien's conceptions and fictional characters as compared to their representation within the D&D game format. In some cases, I believe those who send in pro-Tolkien letters, are trying to impress the creators of D&D as to the worthiness of their Tolkien-quoted statements. I will attempt to explain our position on D&D in conjunction with other worlds of fantasy which influenced its conception, and specifically to clear up the fallacious beliefs regarding Tolkien's fantasy as the only fantasy which inspired D&D. But first, parts of a letter from a concerned player in the same line. Quote, I was influenced greatly by the writings of Tolkien and was led into the world of fantasy by the inhabitants of the Shire. For this reason, I prefer a player characters, elves, and dwarves as my characters. I feel that the roll 3 dice method of determining the prime requisites of the players is fair and equitable for humans, but is ultimately unfair to the non-humans. I feel it is only fair to these non-human beings to make a concession as follows. For elves, roll 3 dice, but put a limit of no less than 12 for strength and 15 for intelligence as minimums, so if less is rolled, the minimum automatically applies. The dwarves as a people are a race of miners and smiths, therefore a strength of less than 14 would be almost unheard of. In Tolkien, the elves made some of the most powerful offensive weapons. I realized that the many varied enchanted blades could not be forged by mere warlocks, but feel that one could be enchanted to a mere +1 by 6 months of hard work. Now, one might say that I am, Rob, nitpicking without reason in presenting this letter. I, for one, believe that this may be a minor problem in the D&D field, but it, along with other disorganized ideas about the actual way or the right way of playing D&D, create a noticeable dividing line between the way we at TSR play the game and the way we intended it to be played. Individualism within the game itself is stressed, and we do not actively go out of our way to remonstrate people for exercising their imagination within their campaign. We also hope that those people will respect the way we play, for we think the designers know best. The game was designed stressing the human aspect of play. Humans being ultimately the strongest and predominant race on any earth. With few exceptions, most worlds of fantasy and swords and sorcery writers are predominantly inhabited by humans. Elves, dwarves, and hobbits were the minority races on Middle-earth, and were never in the spotlight for long periods. Furthermore, D&D was not written to recreate or in any collective way simulate Professor Tolkien's world or beings. A few were included, such as Balrogs, orcs, etc., for it was recognized that Tolkien made some impressions upon the fantasy literature world, which were worth noting and including in D&D, but not to the extent of basing the whole game system around them. That is left up to separate judges. But in doing so, they excommunicate themselves from the actual D&D system. As I stated earlier, we support creative imagination, but we also support the premise of D&D. Those who base their games around a single work, such as Lord of the Rings, are playing a campaign based around Middle-earth. And since D&D was not written to create a basis for one world, it is thus not strict D&D. Players must remember also that elves, dwarves, and similar creatures were around before Tolkien took to the field, and determinations of advancement, etc., are left to the separate authors or judges as the case may arise. Tolkien's elves may have been on the average better than a human of his world, but in D&D it can be quite the opposite. On the other side of the coin, though elves and dwarves are limited to the level they may attain, they gain early advantage, noticing secret doors, sloping passages, etc., which partially makes up for their lower levels later on. One must also remember that this system works with the worlds of Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, L. Sprague de Camp, and Fletcher Pratt, which much better than that of Tolkien. If one is to branch away from the D&D system, let's say towards Tolkien's world, he will be disappointed to find that most spells, characters, etc. do not function well within the epic world of Tolkien's design. The professor was concerned with presenting a well-told tale of sheer magnitude and greatness culminating with the end of the story, end of the characters, end of the world for all it was worth. For what more was there actually to do? There was not a continuing storyline possible, for the story itself was in fact based around the destruction of the ring, and all those events which were spawned from it. As we would say at TSR, quote-unquote, end of adventure. What I am saying is that for a role-playing, continuous adventuring world, Tolkien's does not fit well within the D&D game style. Thus, difficulties will always be found when one attempts to combine D&D and Tolkien's Middle-earth into one. One last piece of information which might help those people out there who are confused about which quote-unquote light Dungeons & Dragons should be taken in, or how the game was inspired, I suggest you read the following. This is an excerpt taken from the foreword to Dungeons & Dragons written by Gary Gygax. Quote, "These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian's adventures, where John Carter was groping through dark pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the De Camp and Pratt fantasies, or Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser pitting their swords against evil sorcerers, will not be likely to find Dungeons & Dragons to their taste. May you never be caught in the dead end by an iron golem! Exclamation point. Rob Kuntz." So, I find this article interesting that when it first started, obviously the biggest fantasy to read at the time was, of course, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series. So it's no great surprise that lots of letters were coming in talking about that, seeing that as perhaps fallaciously the beginnings of Dungeons & Dragons, not realizing where that actually came from. Now, to stress, the Dungeon Master's Guide was not out in the early beginnings, so a lot of this was not specifically stated for a lot of the folks that were picking it up in OD&D, but it wasn't long before that came along, okay? In the late 70s, all right? And also, for me personally, that's why I came to D&D, was from a Tolkien perspective. So I definitely understand these letters. And the games that I run today are very Tolkien-esque in their style. The characters are all heroes. There's no anti-heroes. There's no evil player characters. Neutrality is very vague at best. It always ends up being some sort of greater good, heroic story, going against the great evil that exists out there, where you have the fantastic races that are available to you. And yet, because of their power level, they are, of course, limited by the system, and I totally understand the reasons for that. What I don't attempt to do in my Tolkien-esque world is run Middle-earth in Dungeons & Dragons, because, as Rob said, the system was not designed for that, it's not suited for that, and massive change would have to happen. If you have changed your D&D game or your D&D game setting to Middle-earth, and you've made all of those changes, I'd love to hear about all the trials and tribulations you had in doing all of that converting and then playing in there, and a story or two maybe of how you've had fun doing that, and that'd be awesome to hear. And if you've never actually done that or never thought to do that, but use some other aspects of Middle-earth or Tolkien play in your Dungeons and Dragons, put that in the comments too. I'd love to read that and respond to that. I'm very active and love to respond to everybody who's leaving comments. Again, if you leave nasty comments and, disparaging remarks and, foul language and all this other stuff, I'll delete all of those, of course. But anything else, if you want to talk about the games and then have a good old school discussion or share some things that you've experienced or things that you've done in your games as a DM or whatever, put that on there. I'd love to read that. And I'm going to continue this series too. I'm loving reading these old articles. It just sparks a lot of this stuff that I used to remember back in the day when I first started playing. And I never came from miniature wargaming, but the dungeon master always liked that idea, but he never came from that either. So we went straight from no gaming at all, right straight into the beginnings of Dungeons and Dragons, and immediately then thereafter into advanced D&D. So that's kind of how we got our start. So the miniatures and war gamers on the table were not a thing for us, but I understand that's the history of the game. And so I've really, really loved it for all of these years. And I love talking about all these different things. And I love sharing these old articles to see if it sparks something in you too. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed this reading today and hearing from Rob Kuntz in this Best of Dragon Volume 1. If you like this kind of stuff, again, please give me a thumbs up and a subscribe. Please share with everybody you know. If you're on the fence, please come on board and get on board listening to all this good old school stuff. A lot of the things that I say, for sure, are absolutely, in my humble opinion, only. Okay, however you want to play the game and have fun with it. Hey, enjoy yourself, play the game, and have fun with it. That's all. It's all cool. All right. Okay. Well, this is the end for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll be looking forward to the next one. You all take care, prosper, and happy gaming. Later.